Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Modern Business Operations. My name is Sagi. I'm the CEO and founder of Tonkean. And today I have the pleasure of hosting Ian Smith, the head of insurance operations and LendingTree. Ian, thank you for joining me today.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Sagi. I appreciate it. This will be fun.
Absolutely. Maybe, start simple. Tell us a little bit about yourself, how you got to operations, and maybe a little bit about LendingTree and so like the world of operations in insurance.
Sure. It's how far back do you go? I grew up in rural Montana and forests and rivers and cows and stuff like that. Being told that we couldn't play outside because a bear kept coming onto our street, that kind of thing. I got interested into computers fairly young and taught myself to code and program. That led to some opportunity out in Seattle, where I followed that career trajectory for a while. What I learned along the way was that I kept ending up in these situations where I wasn't talking about how we were to build something or how we were to make it maintainable, but what we were going to build and why and what success looked like. And that kind of led to the operations and execution side of the business. I'm currently head of operations for insurance at LendingTree. LendingTree helps consumers win as they're making financial product decisions. And we have a lot of different industries, but insurance is a pretty big vertical for us. We help over 1 million consumers a month shop competitively their rates for like auto, home, health insurance, those types of things.
That's incredible. I love the maker becoming an operator, and I completely agree. Those are different skills, and I want to come back to it, but maybe while we're on the insurance side of it, and LendingTree is doing amazing. Definitely cannot ignore the financial economic situation, and was kind of wondering how does that affect you guys, or even not about the LendingTree as a company, but the industry as a whole?
Yeah, I mean, there's two sides. A lot of times when I tell people I work at LendingTree, they're focused on the mortgage side and obviously rates contracting, and the demand and the risk tolerance of banks is one thing. Working on the insurance side, it's had its own crazy cycle, particularly through the pandemic. I think the people sometimes don't realize is like we had kind of a reverse response in the pandemic than a lot of industries, because you have an insurance, particularly property casualty insurance, auto and home. They're based on covered risk. And when that risk goes down, the insurance companies become immediately incredibly profitable because they're planning on paying out most of the premiums they take in. So when everybody quit driving, suddenly they were flush with cash. They were spending money on anything they could think of to spend money on. They were issuing refund checks and running expensive TV ad campaigns to tell to gloat over the refunds that they were sending out to people. And key, they were cutting rates. So they were charging less and competing for consumers. As we reopened and drivers started going back into work or just getting back out on the roads, this took a very different turn for the industry. So they went from being very high, riding very high, to a situation where drivers are, the first round of drivers that were coming onto the streets were on much more dangerous streets, because it turns out congestion saves lives. They're moving much faster. Their wrecks were much more destructive than anyone really seen before.
Wow.
Kind of two parallel events. As we really got back to more like normal, the supply chain issues really kicked in. So you had all of these people that they couldn't get parts, they couldn't get their car repaired, they couldn't get labor. You couldn't find rental cars, or not rental cars, but used cars, and you had to run rental cars, a lot longer. And this was compounded by the fact that the insurance industry as a whole, not every company, but the industry as a whole, was charging less for insurance than really they ever had in the last few decades, because they'd cut those rates. So you went from flush with cash and crazy profitable to untold losses. And it's an actuary, math-driven business. So they have a path out, right? You can eventually triumph over that. But those short-term, 3 to 6 month cycles have really taken us all kind of for a loop.
this is uh, honestly fascinating to even think through. Like, I think so easy, for so many people to look at certain events on on face value. And I was always fascinated with like the butterfly effect concept, when
Yep.
when a wing of a butterfly can cause a storm type of idea.
Right. Yeah.
And and I think it's extremely relevant concepts to even kind of where we started with, either you when you build things or when you operate and kind of like strategize, and to kind of think through the um, rolling effects of some of the stuff. I for example, never thought about what you just mentioned with people are driving the roads in a higher risk tolerance because it's open,
Yep.
and they're used to have. I can definitely relate, right? If you were doing that commute and it was always super backed up and sitting on a traffic jam for a while, and now it's all open, you kind of like take a different profile of driving, and people don't
Yep.
see how this is all affects. And I think there's something to learn from it in general that can apply for a lot of different things.
It's very I mean, for a while when this first opened, people were like, is everyone just a terrible driver now? Is everybody driving drunk? And there's probably a little bit of edge cases of that, but a lot of it was, yeah, you couldn't go, 60, 70 miles an hour into Seattle, especially not at high traffic times, because you get slowed down to 30 miles an hour. All of a sudden, you had a whole bunch of people that could go and were changing lanes and doing everything they normally did so much faster. And the roadways, like, it's an organic being, right? The roadways are designed for a certain amount of traffic at a certain amount of speed, but then just organically they end up with the amount of congestion that they're going to have on it. When that changed, and especially when it went from 1 to 2 drivers to not back to congestion levels but way over, it got a lot more dangerous, and it took a while before people started to take note of maybe why. And is there anything you can do about it? I mean, that's a whole other industry, but it impacted insurance in a big way.
Well, you mentioned risk, and it got me thinking about, you know on the startup worlds, especially the tech startup worlds, just in the last few weeks with the Silicon Valley Bank
Yeah.
situation, and really not being able to um pull out deposits before obviously the government stepped in. The risk tolerance, or I should say like the priority of what you would once considered a very, very benign risk that you shouldn't worry about too much, versus situations that, in the last 3 years kind of flip a lot of those things on their head.
Yep.
Um, and I know that's kind of what it made me think about. How do you think through sort of like what is acceptable risk, or like how do you think through reprioritize your risk factors, with all the unpredictability that sort of butterfly effect can have from the last few years?
Yeah. I think, from an operational sort of view and even an entrepreneurial kind of view, like that, this is, it's, you need to adopt the mindset that there's a lot of opportunity here. And I think when you went through the .com crash in '99 or 2008 and the mortgage crash, a lot of businesses were created or suddenly exploded. Coming out of it, didn't feel like they're exploding for 2 or 3 years, but the people who are doing good work found opportunity. The big concern, big focus that I've had is really on trying to make sure we don't freeze. We're in quicksand. It is not stable. Things that, that this partner that was calling you up one week and saying that they had unlimited budget is now exiting the industry. So you have to adapt. And the key thing is not to get frozen, not to get scared, not to sort of shut down, but to keep the team moving and kind of engaged. There's a book that we went through as a team that I really like. It was by a professional poker player named Annie Duke, and it's called Thinking in Bets. And it's basically a discussion of, I mean, various things, but one of the key discussions in there is the idea of resulting and understanding when you look back at something that was successful, was it successful because you played it right? Or did you get lucky? When you look back at something that was a failure, was it a failure because you played it poorly? Or were you unlucky? Like you can have an initiative that has a 90% chance of success, but that means 10% of the time it will be complete and abject failure. But we try and adopt that mindset of looking at those things more as bets versus like they have to work or we are failures if it doesn't work or it reflects on the team. We're looking to say, did we play this hand right? Did we play the opportunity as best we could? Maybe the customer then again exited the industry or made some other change that caused it to be a failure, but understanding, okay, did we build the right thing anyway? Can we use it in a different way? Can we keep adapting and growing? So for me, acceptable risk involves taking action consistently to produce either outcomes or at least learnings. The unacceptable risk really, falls into that category of not moving forward, of getting stuck and saying, we have to rethink everything. Let's take 6 months to do that. You may not have 6 months. You have to keep kind of on your feet and keep moving forward.
Stagnation is basically the highest risk.
Yep.
Right. I could not agree more. Like progress is sort of like the only thing that you want to make constant. Everything else would be subjective or objective to the environment. I think you touched on an incredible point that I think a lot of companies and honestly I think even individuals like contributors struggle with. The externalities are so extreme. Usually they're the 10%, like you said. Usually, what we got used to, in between cycles, right? Between the 2002 to the 2008, between the 2008, like, or 10, like those, in those ranges, there's some status quo that started to form, whether it's a valid one or a healthy one, that's a different story. But, there's a status quo that start to form and you really have some ground rules of what successful outcome looks like.
Yep.
And then comes those externalities that basically swings a lot of those basics concepts out of whack. And I think on a concept level, I think that everyone listening can agree progress and not keep moving, and the quicksand is a really great example. But what would you say is a practical way to think through managing your time, right? Like looking at day in, day out, week in, week out, or you mentioned 6 months, a lot can happen. How do you sort of like take that into practice?
Yeah, the things, the few things I've landed on, there's a phrase I really like, which is you can't steer a parked car. People worry an awful lot about moving in the wrong direction when that's just the start of navigation, right? You can always turn around and go the other way, but it's really hard if you're just sitting there worried about what might be on the other side of that hill. Like there might be construction there and you got to turn around, but you're suddenly moving and you're solving problems as you move along. A thing that I preach quite often internally is this idea of cycles. To say you basically have 52 cycles in the year, you have 52 weeks. But if we're just being honest and you look at that and say, well, we're going to lose some cycles in like December around the holidays. You're going to lose some cycles where a lot of people are on vacation over the summer. You have short weeks for holidays, during the year, and that's probably goes down to somewhere between 40 and 45 actual kind of weeks where you can make a difference to the business. Coming from the development side, but I see the same things happen on whether it's media or sales. But coming from the development side, there's a level of risk aversion that starts to kick in where we don't want to make changes on a Thursday or Friday. What if it breaks? Will we catch it before it's the weekend? Will we catch it before Monday? You don't want to make changes on a Monday because you want to see if everything is running the way you expect in kind of that business cycle. So that really leaves you like 2-ish days a week where you can make dramatic changes, where the organization is comfortable making dramatic changes. If you waste those 2 days, you've wasted a week, right? Not that anything like this ever happens, but if you had the situation where you were going to try and kick off a project and a critical person was on vacation, and so it's like, well, instead of meeting today, on a Wednesday, let's kick it out to next Friday when that person's back. Well, you've spent 2 cycles. And if you have that meeting and they like need some data, and so you send it over to some analysts, well, that's another couple of cycles. You then are now ready to pitch it to the customer and they say they need changes. Well, you're another 2 to 3 cycles. So it is not hard to end up in a situation where before anybody has done any real actual work to see if this is viable in the marketplace, you're 7, 8 cycles in. And if you're wrong, if the partner says, I'm not interested or I need dramatic changes, it's very inconceivable to be basically half of your year on something relatively small, something that everybody agreed at the start was small. So a lot of that thinking in cycles is like, how do you open up the rest of the week? What do people need to hear so they make a change on a Thursday or Friday instead of always deferring, to lower that risk? What do you need to do to get people to schedule that meeting this afternoon, or to follow up one-on-one with that person, or to really understand the problem, or look for that data right now to see if it's available, instead of let's do it again at our next one-on-one, which is 3 cycles away, right? So there's a lot of that I try and push to say you only have so many opportunities throughout the year, and it's far less than you think to make a difference on the business. Otherwise, just that's, if you think about it, like, of course you have OpEx, you have things, you have the money you're spending. The one thing you're guaranteed to spend no matter what you're doing is that time. And that's a way to think about that time and say, like, your budget this quarter is 13 cycles. What are you going to do with that budget to make a difference? Because if you want to spend 6 of those cycles talking about it, you're not going to do anything this quarter. Maybe you'll be ready next quarter, but by the time everything else kicks in, you have to move from kind of the talking to taking some kind of an action.
I think the action is a big part of it too, right? I think there's another concept, some methodology of like really being action biased.
Yep.
And sort of like, and you mentioned it with, I love the steering car thing. It's exactly that concept, be driven by do it now and do it versus like, let's talk about it. And I don't know if you feel it, but I definitely think that in the last few years, with the Zoom and virtual meetings being the easiest form of communication, it kind of distorted the ability to huddle quickly and act.
Yep.
Because there's always another meeting and always another meeting, and the cost of getting to a room together is lower because you can just click a button. And so people, end up talking more than doing. And I think this Tuesday, Wednesday is probably the equivalent. It's probably the most visual thing I've heard about how you waste time by just waiting.
Yep.
And I think on a personal level too, I have young kids, you can see it on them. And sometimes, when you look at young kids, it's sort of like a reflection to your soul, because we're all just kids that kind of like grow, grow tall versus, really sort of like anything else. And how hard it is for them to start the week. And the Mondays are always hard. They came back home like, emotional. And Fridays are always hard, because it's like the entire week. And so you really exactly what you're saying, that 2.5 days of productivity during the week when the energy is high enough, your mindset is in it. And like you said, with the equivalent of sprints or development cycle, you also don't want to risk the, starting something and not being able to complete it. I think it's really the simplest visualization I've heard for a long time. So I think this is really good stuff.
And it doesn't, I mean, I've got my kids are a little older, And it doesn't change, right? I mean, it's pretty easy to look. I mean, maybe Fridays get a little bit better, but Mondays are like, well, it's predictable. Everyone is feels terrible, and they're having a hard time getting back to up to speed. And then you're like, why was Monday so hard by the time you get to Wednesday? And then you start to
Yeah.
wind down again. Yeah, I think people way overestimate the risks of doing the wrong thing, which I've kind of reiterated here, and underestimate the risks of waiting too long. There's a law that I because I had started to do this, and I'm like, I'll bet you that there's a law out here, but it's called Cummings' law. And the idea around that is it's an internet phenomenon, which is if you were to go out and ask a question versus go out and post an incorrect answer, you're much more likely to get engagement and the correct answer out of posting the wrong thing than you will asking for help. People respond to fix things that they see that are wrong. They don't necessarily respond to sort of that open-ended opportunity, for sure. So the way I think that plays out in leadership a little bit is you have an opportunity to try and get engagement out of people over accuracy. And there's a lot, especially as leaders, we get nervous. We want to be correct. We don't want to have egg in our face. But I think there's value in engagement, even if you're going to look, uninformed or incorrect or whatnot. If something I've done is that if you have like a status meeting on 3 projects, putting them all up on the whiteboard with the status of unstarted is going to get you a lot more engagement than if you put a question mark. Say, hey, help me fill in the status on all of these, because people will say, oh, it's not unstarted. And then they'll have a debate about what unstarted will look like and what they've actually done and how fast they're moving. You can do the same thing with like connecting items together that maybe or maybe don't have a dependency, or putting up due dates that maybe are unreasonable. But if somebody's going to argue with you about a due date and say that can't be done by the end of the month, but I can make sure it's done by mid next month, they have a lot more ownership in that than if I went and said, well, reasonably mid to late next month. That's a license for them to take it through the end of the quarter. So there is a value there. Even if you feel like you're going to look stupid, people won't remember that you looked stupid. People remembered that they helped you and that they have a sense of ownership over the project that they didn't have before, because it's their baby that they're correcting misinformation around, and they're going to own and drive forward.
I love this. I didn't know about the name of it, but I could not tell you how my entire life I've been feeling the same. The way I used to think about it all the time was the difference between a riddle and a puzzle.
Yep.
And that, with a riddle is an open-ended. You don't like, there's just a statement and it's like an open question. There's too many ways it can go. There's also the fear of the other side of being wrong, which is kind of like the same point or open nerve that you're kind of playing on from the other side. But when if you have a puzzle, it is a much easier, again, go back to kids, as an example, it's a much easier for a very young toddler even to look at a puzzle that is been put wrong and say, this is not the right way.
Yep.
Right. Versus if you just give him the pieces and an open thing, or like build it, and like, it's much harder. And I love it. I love the question mark versus like just put a date there or just put a status there. Or, I've as a leader have seen a lot of times where you really want to get people involved and you really want to get people grassrooting a solution right from the start, because that's kind of how they are a lot more engaged with it. It's part of their own work. And so it's much likely that they'll be accountable for it. But the issue, like you said, is that the 0 to 1 thing is actually not a skill that everyone necessarily have or feel comfortable doing. They might have grew up in an environment that didn't encourage that, and many other reasons. But therefore, like putting a very ugly mock of something, a very, very like stripped down, full with assumptions, draft, that actually exactly invigorates your point, which is because they're in the job of editors. Now they're in the job of like, no, this doesn't make sense. This doesn't work. This doesn't work. This is not, but if you just do the opposite, just give them like, okay, we want to create this utopian thing. What do you think? You'll hear crickets. So very, very actionable, I think, tip for anyone.
Yeah, it's people rise to the occasion, but if they will look for ways to defer that problem back to the leadership of like, well, you figure out what to ask us to do. It's like once you get something more specific out there, even if it's wrong, and I find this is true. Like I'm not good at drawing on whiteboards. I'm always in front of people drawing on whiteboards. I'm not a good speller. I'll spell things on whiteboards in front of people, and I will send misspellings to people in email, not intentionally, but boldly, because people are more likely to engage with that and say like, hey, you misspelled this, and here's my thought on what's going on. There's a level, it shifts the power dynamic, right? From the boss comes to say to like, well, I can help the boss. I see some stuff that he doesn't know about this. Let me tell him about this. Let me tell him what I can do for this situation if he really wants to go there. Versus always being in the position of trying to sell a reason to engage and a reason to care about something. It's like, well, yeah, I'll engage with that when you've nailed down every possible scenario and problem. Well, that's what I'm paying you for. I need you to come along and help me do that. I can't do that.
So you give really good advice, and I think all of those points are incredibly actionable. But I like to ask, what is maybe an advice that you got early in your career or just in life that you want to pay forward?
That's good. I mean, it's a good question. Something that comes to mind is less advice, but more it kind of came through some training. When early, one of my first jobs was at a grocery store, and they kind of did a day of customer service training. And one of the things that really stuck with me was the idea of smiling and making eye contact. I think that is, and I do know that there's some cultural relevance to that because not every culture does that work. But in the U.S. in particular, if you're smiling, you're making eye contact, people can tell that you're present. People that can tell that you're interested in them. People can tell that you care. People can tell that you're having a good time. And people want to be around others that are having a good time and that care about them and that are interested. And the other really valuable insight that was sort of thrown out in that process is that even if you don't feel happy, smiling, making eye contact, your brain chemistry does not like that inconsistency, and it will conform your feelings to your outward expression. And so it is a way to go. And after you've kind of gone through that and done that some, you really notice it. I mean, you notice it when you go in and buy coffee, or you go into a meeting and the people look, act, their shoulders are hunched, they can't stand up straight. They embody not having a good time and not wanting to engage. And so I don't know, that one really sticks with me as kind of a transformative thing you can do, whatever your role is.
Yeah, so true, so simple. I love it. Ian, that was awesome. If anyone want to chat with you on any of the above or other, where can they find you? Is it LinkedIn? Is it Twitter?
LinkedIn's a great place. Yeah, for sure. And I mean, I like to make friends. I like to solve problems. I like to help people. And I like to hang out with people who kind of have a similar mindset. So yeah, I'd love it if you reached out on LinkedIn. We'd be happy to chat.
Awesome. Well, maybe people will send you smiley faces.
That's
and,
right.
and eyes. Awesome. Ian, that was awesome. Thank you. Thank you for your time. And it was a great conversation.
All right. Thank you, Sagi. I appreciate it.